It's our pleasure here at Archbold to invite and welcome Jen Miller here today. She's got a great title of her talk. You had $1 million. I'd like to say if you had $1 billion, but go ahead. What species would you save? I'm really excited about this because Jen's coming here, obviously as an eminent scientist. She has a PhD in ecology and wildlife conservation from Yale, and then went into the US Fish and Wildlife Service. So I'm hoping some of you will have the opportunity to talk with her about academic careers and then moving into agency type of positions and how that's an opportunity from a career perspective. I'm going to take the privilege of asking Sahas Bharve to give a more detailed introduction. He has a special insight into Jen. And I know he will give you a wonderful flavor of her background and relevance for this talk today. So Jen, thank you very much for joining us, and we're looking forward to what you have to say. Thanks, everyone. Oh, just before I start, are there any introductions we should have done? Good. Okay.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to take this opportunity to roast Jenny a little bit before. No, I'm just kidding. Okay. So yeah, as Hilary said, Dr. Jen Miller has a degree in organismal biology from Claremont McKenna College and a PhD from the Yale School of Forestry, now the Yale School of the Environment. Jen has worked on a diversity of animals, including poison dart frogs in Costa Rica, pheasants in the Himalayas, lions in Africa, and wolves in the Western US. While she's largely office-bound right now, I've seen her work tirelessly outside all day in 110-degree heat. And after working with her for about 1 week in central India, where she was working on tigers for her dissertation, I decided I wasn't strong enough to do that and decided to work in much cooler mountains. She's published over 35 papers in peer-reviewed journals, including papers on all big cats of the world except the snow leopard, and has also written perspective pieces in prestigious journals like Science, with prestigious people like E.O. Wilson and Michael Sule. Jen has worked in a diversity of organizations from R1 universities, national and international NGOs, to now the US federal government. After working with big cats for a decade, she finally saw the light and now works on birds and international wildlife trafficking that she'll talk about today. Because of her stellar career record and friendly, approachable personality, Jen has mentored scores of students on how to navigate a career in conservation. So I urge staff and interns to sign up for time to speak with her tomorrow morning. Without further ado, Jen Miller.
What Sahas didn't mention is that birds were my very first species that I ever studied. So Sahas found the light, maybe. Thank you, Sahas, and thank you, Hilary. Thanks, Laura, for helping get me set up, and thank you to the program directors and the rest of you for inviting me here today. It's such an honor to connect with you. We've moved here about a year ago, and so I've been wanting to better kind of root in with your community, so it's really a privilege to connect with you, and I hope this talk is just the beginning of more collaborations. So I just live 10 minutes away, so I'm here. So today we're gonna probably talk about, I hope, things that maybe you haven't thought about before. I'm gonna take you into the depths of the federal government and try to share a little bit more about what it's like to work in a grant program to try to expose more of the thinking that goes into how we produce different financial assistance programs. And so this talk is very much a real world scenario where my program had $1 million, actually more dollars than that. I wish $1 billion, but hopefully Congress one day will recognize the need. And so we have designed a new grant program around wildlife trade. So we'll be talking about today. So I'm going to talk about the behind the scenes of financial assistance, the role of funding also as a very important first step or somewhere towards the beginning of the conservation process, the opportunities and sideboards of what it's actually like to do conservation at this stage in the US government. I'm going to talk about wildlife trafficking, which is the threat that I specifically work on. And we're going to look at songbirds for singing competitions from South America and the Caribbean as our case study. And we're going to, in all of that, I'll be demonstrating how we're holistically tackling this interdisciplinary problem of a socio-ecological system. So we'll do all of this in an hour. I threw a lot of slides in here, so I may end up forwarding through some of them. We'll see where we end up on this journey together. So in 2019, just before the pandemic, my branch had this challenge. We had been already running a financial assistance program on wildlife trade for about, I think at that point, maybe 6 years. But we had some challenges and we wanted to restructure. And so we found ourselves facing this question. If you had $1 million, what species should we save? In fact, even bigger than that, how should we tackle wildlife trafficking? So we had a little over $1 million to invest every year. And all of these different sideboards, which I'll get into. But just to emphasize, I'm really taking you into that depths of what that looks like from our perspective as non-scientists, but those with scientific training in large part. So this is my team. Everything I talk about today is in very close partnership with them. The photographs are showing the Combating Wildlife Trafficking branch, which is where I'm based. We're based in the International Affairs Program of the Fish and Wildlife Service. We are a collection of program officers that largely have ecological backgrounds like myself. But we also have social scientists who help us think about the pairing and the human dimensions, the behaviors that drive wildlife trade. We've partnered really closely with Foundations of Success. And so I want to acknowledge our facilitators to much of this process. We're very appreciative of their support. And we've had the support and partnerships of a lot of different people within the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as we've built this program. The money that we're talking about here is actually your tax dollars. So you, in part, and your families have helped support this program from afar. So special thanks to you. So Sahas asked me to talk a little bit about my background, which he's in large part shared already, but just to give you some context about how I'm standing here today with you. I've had a career that's really been driven largely and rooted in science. So ecology and wildlife, ecology of especially vertebrates and carnivores was what grasped my attention from the beginning. And I've worked on, again, a lot of different species across different landscapes, but what has always grabbed my attention is kind of what drives people, what causes us to create our interactions with wildlife, and how do those manifest on the landscape and affect both us and the wildlife themselves. So human-wildlife conflict around livestock depredation was the focus of my PhD, looking at how tigers and leopards killed on the landscapes of India and central India, a very hot landscape that Sahas couldn't handle. But, you know, it's taken me to different places. I've worked for a number of different nonprofit organizations like Defenders of Wildlife and Panthera, done my postdocs through universities in an applied way, and ended up now with the government, which I never set out to do. So I'd be happy to talk with any of you about what it's like to work in those different sectors and move between them. I think personally now, you know, life is long, your journey is long, who knows where I'll end up, but it's just wonderful to be able to get different perspectives and affect conservation from those different lenses. So let's dive into wildlife trafficking. Wildlife trafficking, just to orient you, is when wild plants and animals are removed from the wild and sold as a commodity. The point here is that it's illegal. So there's wildlife trade and there's wildlife trafficking, which is the illegal side of that. And because it's unregulated, it's illicit. And so it's actually very challenging to track and understand. And it can lead to species declines. Not always, but sometimes. Trade can be domestic, just within a country, or it can be international and transboundary across countries. So people are usually familiar with ivory, tigers, maybe parrots, but there's a whole suite of species that are trafficked. And wildlife trafficking is actually the third largest illegal trade behind counterfeiting and drugs. So it's very high up there, and it's often there's convergence between different types of trade and illegal activities. The US is actually among one of the largest documented markets in the world for illegal wildlife products. We have estimates of about $2 billion per year of illegal products coming into and out of the US. There is a data bias because, like I said, it's hard to track, and not a lot of countries actually report consistently that, you know, the seizures that are made, and they have different kinds of capacities for that. So we always caveat that we don't actually know truly where the US falls, but we have such a large economy that, of course, you would guess that it would be quite large. And so the most common products are things like crocodilian and ostrich leather, or corals, or live reptiles like these turtles, and live birds like the songbirds here. And there are a lot of different reasons that people might trade, and a lot of different types of products that can come from those species. So people, you know, create demand based on wanting jewelry or decorative products. They consume through even traditional medicine, but other reasons as well, like wild meats. There's carving, construction, instruments is actually a big thing that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife provides support on for permits. Every time an orchestra moves between countries, they need to import their instruments. And of course, zoos, which we all love and appreciate. But private collections as well, and collectors drive a lot of plant trade. So what I think is actually interesting to think about is maybe tune into where your implicit biases are headed as we talk about poachers and we think about who's consuming these products. But you know, you might envision like the poachers who are taking the rhinos or tigers, but how many times have you gone through an airport and not declared the souvenir that you bought or the fresh fruit maybe you're bringing into the country? Can I see a show of hands? I myself have also done this. I think most of us have done this. Come on, admit it to yourself. Yeah. Yeah, and so why did you do that? Maybe was it unclear that there were rules requiring you to declare? Or maybe you were like, oh, I'm so late, I got to get out of the airport, I think this is going to be a big hassle. Or maybe you were a little bit fearful of the authority and what might come as a repercussion for that. There's a lot of reasons that people traffic by not declaring their products as they come through boundaries. And so I think it's useful to just reflect that actually many of us have been a trafficker at one point or another in our lives. And so there are definitely crime syndicates that are driving crime and a lot of hurtful activities to both people and wildlife, and doing it for pretty bad reasons associated with terrorism and all of that. But there are also a lot of people that are trafficking because they don't have the capacity or the money to apply for a permit, or they believe that the rules are not, you know, in their favor, or acknowledging a tradition maybe that their culture recognizes. So there's a lot of reasons that people traffic. So it's good to pay attention to that, especially when we're thinking about how do you solve these problems. And so the complexity of trade chains is actually what makes wildlife trafficking, in my opinion, so sticky and complex and interesting, and different from a lot of other types of conservation work. Because it mixes wildlife biology, economics, social psychology, international diplomacy, and a lot of other fields and sciences in order to tackle these issues. So this is what a trade chain looks like. It starts with a supplier, like a harvester or a farmer. The product then moves to a processor, to a suite of intermediaries, like an exporter or an importer or a transporter, then to a wholesaler or a retailer, and finally to the consumer. And so it crosses a lot of different physical localities, through different kinds of communities and through different individuals. Think about many different systems of governance as the product moves between boundaries. And so in short, there are lots of different multiple systems of rules, beliefs, attitudes, and motivations that these products are moving through. And so to tackle this problem, you need to understand all of that in order to identify the barriers to better set up trade. And so in my team, this is why we have social scientists working with financial assistance experts and ecologists and biologists, because we need to approach this from a systems thinking perspective. So this is like a classic eco-cultural, complicated, coupled system. So the US government has a lot that we've done recently to combat wildlife trafficking. Starting with the Obama administration, we saw the very first executive order in 2013 on wildlife trafficking. So that's how recent this issue has been recognized as a major threat, both to biodiversity and to national security. And it's one of the reasons, in fact, the biosecurity thinking about the pandemic, but also national security, that this is a bipartisan issue. So in 2016, with bipartisan support, the END Act was passed, which set up a presidential task force on wildlife trafficking, which creates a multiple agency collaboration to try to tackle this from different perspectives. So we're bringing together Department of Justice, Department of State, USAID, Department of Interior, which is one of the co-leads, to meet regularly and try to tackle this issue. We've seen executive orders since from the Trump administration and also the Biden administration. We expect whatever next administration to come in to also recognize this as an issue and to continue the funding that we have for this. So we're very fortunate in that way that there are so many complexities, both for people and wildlife, that we're able to be recognized as an important issue. And so around 2016, my program was established, the Combating Wildlife Trafficking Branch in International Affairs. And our mission is to provide both help and money to government nonprofit organizations, multilateral institutions like different secretariats that work across the world, and governments. So the scale of our work is about $2 million from Congress, from your taxpayer dollars. We also have money that we get through USAID, the Bureau of Narcotics, different agencies that receive way more money than we do and funnel it towards us because we can do work that they can't. So in terms of scale, we've so far awarded about $11 million through 86 grants and cooperative agreements, which are a little more collaborative. In this first phase of our work that went to multiple species and landscapes, it was a big call that we put out just asking for projects to be pitched to us for anything that would help tackle wildlife trafficking. And our grants are usually $100,000 to $1 million over 2 to 5 years, which, that's broken down over those 2 to 5 years. But we have encountered a number of different challenges. That was a very broad scope that I told you about, sort of a global program. And yet there were specific lesser known trade issues that were less funded, like certain species that we noticed that just weren't getting attention, and certain regions that weren't getting attention. We know in conservation there's big biases across the charismatic species, right? We also tended to be supporting traditional law enforcement laws and policies, community rangers, which are effective, but do receive a good amount of money from international donors, and new tech, so sort of hype buzzwords, things like that. But there were also things we were hearing about, like this interdisciplinary approach, like a social science perspective, human dimensions, this sort of human behavior that we were noticing wasn't receiving a lot of support. And it was really hard to measure the impact when you're funding a turtle over here for 5 years and then a plant over here for a couple of years. It's just hard. And then switching, to a different project, it's really hard to have consistency and actually know that the money you're investing is making an impact, so we can come back to Congress and taxpayers and say, this is how the money was invested and this is what we used with it. So we came up with a new goal. We wanted to design a targeted, interdisciplinary, and of course effective financial assistance program to combat wildlife trafficking. Or in other words, if we had $1 million, what should we save? And how do we do that? Of course, there's sideboards when you're working in an organization. And so we had some logistics that I want to share with you. And here I'm starting to get a little more deep into the things that you might not see as a public, because we don't share this kind of information typically in a report or something on our website. So $1.5 million annually in the scheme of things actually is not very much money. I mean, Hillary, you were joking, maybe, but probably not, because $1 billion is much more at the scale to actually start to tackle wildlife trafficking. But we have $1.5 million and we're very grateful for it. These funds is what's called cancel after 2 years. So the government has 2 years, that we have as an agency, 2 years to get that money out the door to an NGO like Archbold. And the money will expire after 5 years. So Archbold has 5 years to spend that money. And if you don't, it disappears back to Treasury, back to the US Treasury. It doesn't disappear, but the intention for that is over. And so we had to figure out what's the scale? How's this going to work? We also wanted a repeatable program model that we wouldn't have to reinvent every year. Of course, our mandate is for global wildlife trafficking, so the illegal side of trade. And you may notice that Fish and Wildlife is a very species-oriented program. We have an Endangered Species Act, which actually gives us the law and authority to do the work that we do. And that, as a unit, species is our kind of guiding unit there. So we thought, you know, that's interesting. Maybe we should stick with that. Let's think about how that should affect our programming. And then, of course, you have all the dynamics within a program. So within international affairs, we have a suite of different divisions. We do a lot of work on CITES, the Convention of International Convention of Endangered Trade of Fauna and Flora. And we also have these multinational conservation funds, like the rhino tiger, marine turtle, freshwater turtle, elephant, and they also give money. They have even more money than we do to give. And so we didn't want to overlap with them, and we wanted to complement them in some ways. We have an Office of Law Enforcement. They do a lot of work, both domestically, but also abroad. And there's a suite of other agencies like I talked about. And so anyways, we were thinking about all of these different sideboards. We also wanted to think about the bigger picture and how science and conservation practitioners outside have critiqued how international funding is invested. So there's this rich debate on conservation investment, pointing out that there are mismatches between conservation priorities and spending, like the hotspots, for example. There's a lot of different prioritization templates, endemic bird areas, centers of plant diversity, so on and so on. And of course, like I mentioned, there are these disparities in funding of what actually gets funded, tending to lean towards these charismatic, well-known species. And specific for wildlife trafficking, most of that also applies. So we don't have frameworks that guide how wildlife trafficking money should be invested. And I point this out because this would be a really cool topic for a master's project or an internship, starting to think about what are the parallels between the different international donors that invest, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars every year in this topic and how that money should be spent. But we don't have a framework like that at the moment. And so we're operating in a vacuum where we have to reflect on our own priorities. We see the same disparities mirrored for wildlife trafficking that we see for wildlife conservation overall. So there's plant blindness. There's that, you know, focus on tigers, rhinos, you know, elephants. I personally think, you know, all of those species need the money that goes to it. We just don't have enough money in general to support this work. And so hard decisions do need to be made. And so it's important to recognize that there's these big gaps, both in species and in landscapes, like South America is a big gap generally. So as we dove into thinking about all of these different sideboards, we chose an approach called the Conservation Standards, or the Open Standards, which is an open access, really great conservation framework that the service uses, but so many others do as well. And this, in short, is using what's called, you create a situation model. So you're basically creating a logic model that shows, you know, the logical steps in order to solve a problem. You start by saying, what is our problem? And you map out all the different factors that affect that. And then you create a results chain where you look at the solution and you create a logic model for that. And so in pairing these two things, we're able to kind of map out the issue and start to brainstorm in a logical way some of the answers. And this is called a theory of change. How many of you guys have used the Open Standards of Conservation before? That's awesome. If you're, you know, especially if you're early in your career, but even if you're at any stage and you want to start to beef up the way that you think about problems and solutions, I really encourage leaning into this community. It's all freely accessible online. There's also some really great trainings you can do, coaches you can access. And it's basically trying to align the whole conservation community in the same jargon and the same approach. It's kind of similar to structured decision-making, if anyone's done that. There's a couple different, of course, frameworks for this, but I really have enjoyed this process. So what you end up producing is something very messy and complicated. It's blurred out for a reason, and we did this with Foundations of Success. I'll simplify it for you and give you this slide instead, just to save us time. But basically, this is what our results chain for the whole program at the program level that we created for our new financial assistance program. And so in short, I'll just briefly walk you through it. We decided to start with a species-oriented program, again, because of that unit that Fish and Wildlife tends to use, and because it was specific enough that people could understand it, that we could tell good stories, and we could start to track a species and the products associated with it. Another reason that species are useful in trade is because products are from a certain species, usually a single species. And so we don't tend often to see products mixed and matched species together. So it's sort of the best way to track trade. So if we could understand what species need to be prioritized and which are threatened primarily by trafficking, and then we understood the problems through an interdisciplinary strategic lens, then we felt we would be able to pull together these strategic collaborative partnerships with the right expertise in order to measure impact. And the steps with the triangle are all an indicator of success that we associated with that step. I won't have time to go into that today, but I'm happy to answer questions if you have them. And so once these partnerships, these networks are supported, we felt that we could start to fund them and create different opportunities that would also involve adaptive learning as we really together tried to tackle these challenging issues, especially for a species that weren't otherwise receiving funding. And so a big part of also what we were thinking about is in order for partnerships to last, they need capacity and they need support. And so we are leaning into the capacity building side of this work too. And so the final stage, this is the farthest right, is that you see in purple, the trafficking threat is reduced for whatever the species is. And then there's all these other benefits like the species status. We actually didn't, in this one, I don't show a human well-being factor, but that's also a very important side that usually comes kind of as the end. So this is just such a quick overview. I wish I could go in detail. It almost doesn't make sense probably, but that's a very high level overview. So in maybe a little bit of like more detail in terms of the program vision, we decided to focus on the species. We modeled out spending $4 to $5 million per species over 10 years of implementation. So that's 2 to 3 funding opportunities. We felt that that was the right scale to sort of launch new species work on a species that had never been funded before, to try to then attract other donors to keep that work going, which would allow us to then shift to another species. And so this Catalyst program, this concept is what we decided to go with, these short-term sparks of investment that mobilize longer-term conservation. We wanted it to be evidence-based. We wanted it to be adaptive, so flexible, and collaborative to achieve the most effective conservation possible. And we really wanted to prioritize the human dimension side of it, the social science research to tackle that interdisciplinary complex trade chain issue. So I thought I would linger a little bit on our method that we came up for prioritizing species because you guys are scientists and I thought you'd really enjoy this part. Again, it's hard to choose out of the many, many species that are threatened by trafficking. And so we came up with a framework for how to prioritize. Specifically for our Species Conservation Catalyst Fund, which is what we started to call our program. So we defined a species as a species or a group of species that have similar threats and require the same types of interventions to solve those threats. We developed initially a pool of candidate species that we developed based on a lot of different conversations with our sister agencies, with CITES documents, major reports like the UNODC Wildlife Crime Report. We looked at scientific articles. We got other information from donors and what they're investing in, looked at news agencies. I mean, we just pulled together as much information as we could find to figure out what are the species that really are being threatened by wildlife trafficking. And we had a whole suite of criteria and factors that we were looking for specifically. So we have these 2 criteria categories. The first is the conservation criteria. So first of all, is international trafficking, international illegal trade, a major threat to that species. And it had to be international because it'd be kind of inappropriate if we waltzed into South Africa and said, hey, you have a cycad trade problem, let's solve it for you, right? There's very little implications for the US perhaps. So we had to make sure the US was involved either in that trade or somehow felt like we were the right partner to support that work. So this is as a government agency, we do have that dimension to how our funding should be invested. The second was looking at funding. So we wanted to try to support a species that lacked funding for anti-trafficking. We also looked at the recovery potential for that species. So if the species was really slow reproducing or didn't seem for various biological reasons that it would be savable, it wouldn't be a good candidate for us. We then looked at the implementation criteria, which were things like the alignment within our program. So what policies, what species have attracted a lot of policy attention, perhaps have a lot of buy-in from our own staff. What enabling conditions exist politically and socially? Is it the right moment to work on the species in the country? We looked at the whole of government approach from the US government, all those different agencies I talked about to understand what are they working on, where are their gaps, and how could we complement them? And we looked at impact. We thought about the compounding and durable impacts of these investments. So with all of that, we actually created a spreadsheet where we score our different candidates. And then once those scores kind of reveal the top candidates, we then assess them and get together as a team and talk about all these different factors together in addition to the scoring, and then select a candidate to work on. Following that, there's a multi-month process where we dive into that species to, again, fully refine and make sure that's the right species. So this is our prioritization process at the moment and has produced 3 different species to date. So our species program life cycle has these 4 stages where we prioritize the species like I talked about, then we identify the needs for that specific species. We then fund activities and projects that will address those needs, and then we evaluate and reflect and share the results of that. All guided by the open standards for the practice of conservation. And so these are the 3 species that we have identified to date. No plant species yet, but they're definitely on the table for the next 4th species, or a marine species. Those are the 2 kind of groups that we're thinking about for the 4th. So we have saiga antelope in Central Asia, cheetah, specifically cub trafficking from the Horn of Africa to the Middle East, and songbirds. Songbirds are trafficked also in Asia, but they receive a lot more attention in that landscape. So we decided to focus in South America and the Caribbean, where the singing competitions occur specifically. So if you want to check out more on this, that's our website. But let me tell you about songbirds. And the idea here is that we're going to be launching a new species every 3 to 5 years as the funding becomes available. And we cycle through these species. So we'll talk about songbirds now. So songbirds was selected from these top 5 species candidates. And it was a really rich conversation. Any of these species certainly could have made it as our 3rd species. I was particularly attached to the seahorses or the cycads. I thought that was a really interesting issue. But each of these kind of had different strengths and weaknesses. For example, the cycads in South Africa truly is mostly driven by domestic trade, although there is a smaller international trade to the US too. My branch had already invested in scarlet macaws, and they do tend to receive more attention. And so in the end, there were various reasons, but we landed on songbirds in Guyana Shield and the Caribbean. And I'm the program officer for this group. So songbirds offered us a new taxonomic regional diversification from the 2 mammals that we had selected before. There's limited awareness globally of the trade in that geography. It's also a really high profile issue for the US Fish and Wildlife. So it's not only a focus of our CITES policy efforts for the last, decade or longer, but a number of live birds are frequently and consistently seized by our Office of Law Enforcement at the ports around the US. So about 500 birds per year are seized, and these are live animal shipments. So every time a batch comes through either as 1 or 2 birds, or sometimes 200 or 500. That requires a lot of attention by our Office of Law Enforcement. And so the resources involved in this trafficking specifically is a big issue. There's also some interesting One Health dimensions to it, as you can imagine, for a bird, which is a higher risk species for zoonotic spillover, and also some potential partnerships with indigenous communities down in South America. We felt also that this was appropriate as a scale for a $5 million seed fund. So I'm going to show you a quick video to give you a sense of what a singing competition is and the communities that are involved in this. This video is a news clip focused on the singing competitions in Guyana, and these are legal competitions in the country. So just keep that in mind.
God, family, birds. That's my life.
This sound means it's dawn in Guyana, and if it's Sunday, that means the showdown is not too far off. Bird owners gather across the country to proudly exhibit their birds and have them face off against each other in whistling competitions called Guyana Speed Singing Contests.
Bird for me is not just competing, it's somewhat of my therapy. I look forward to attempt and take care of this bird on a daily basis. I really do.
It's a centuries-old tradition where male finches are caged next to each other as judges count the number of chirps they emit in the span of 5 minutes. The first to reach 50 chirps within this time span wins, or if the time expires, whichever had the most tweets.
It's more of a civilized whistle that we have. So they will take a process and learn to whistle like that. And then we bring them on the competition.
Which can be profitable. Average singers go for around $75, while those that have won several times can cost up to $10,000. Demand for these birds is so high, they're often smuggled to places like New York. But these birds are literally not just for show. They're family members who, during the week, tag along just about everywhere. Take, for instance, 18-year-old Mark Jr. He's collecting this wild grass for his bird's breakfast.
It's different. Bird is bring money. Bird is like loving. It's like if you late, the bird don't whistle. You wake right till you waking up.
How sweet the sound. For Inside Edition Digital, I'm Stephanie Officer.
So the songbird competition trade, as we know it, is moving mostly from Guyana, Suriname, Brazil, Venezuela, through up to Trinidad, the US, Canada, the Netherlands, possibly France. There's possibly other areas of transit that we don't know yet, but this truly is both a domestic trade, because you just saw competitions where the end destination was Georgetown in Guyana, but they also move internationally. So some portion of the birds that are coming from Southern Guyana, where we've located at least one population where these birds are sourced from, both move to domestic markets as well as international trade. We've met some of the trappers, and they are self-identified trappers. That's not a word that's applied to them. They very proudly use this as a source of income, just one source of income. And they're located in rural communities, sometimes indigenous communities. And those birds are going to songbird keepers in urban areas, mostly adult men. This isn't a hobby for women. And those are in the Guyana Shield and Caribbean or global diaspora. Now, the trade that I've shown you here is the Guyana Shield trade, but there's interestingly also trade of different species from Cuba to Florida. And that's, of course, most of the species we get here in Miami. But these birds also from the Guyana Shield do move to Miami as well, and also to Los Angeles. So in this talk, I'm going to talk probably mostly about the Guyana Shield trade, because we didn't receive any successful applications for the Caribbean trade from Cuba to Florida in this first notice of funding. So I've been focusing my attention mostly on these species. And so here is one of the trophies, for example, that you might win in a competition like this. There's a racing board on the bottom. And this is where you put two male birds together and they sing their territorial song that has been trained to be a certain sequence of notes in order to qualify. So we have noticed that there is high bird mortality as these birds are traded. they're transported, especially. We're not too familiar with the domestic trade transport methods, but when they're carried internationally, they're stuffed into hair curlers, which makes them go quiet because it's dark. And I don't know how silent it is, but the birds go silent when they're put in hair curlers. And they're either put into a carry-on or they're body carried, which is when they're stuffed into jackets or pants and then carried onto a plane. Either way, they go onto the plane and then arrive, and they move through customs that way. And so there is a lot of mortality, as you can imagine. There's also market exploitation of people. So those trappers that I talked about might sell a single bird for $10, which can make $10,000 later on in the trade chain. So you can see that they're not receiving their fair share. And we're noticing anecdotally, but also starting to build up scientific evidence that there are populations being threatened by this trade. These are the 15 species that we've identified have current or potential declines due to singing competition. The one potential decline is the red siskin, which is already endangered, but is a possible substitute species if some of these other species decline. And so right now, the chestnut-bellied seed finch, or the toa toa, is the most popular bird competitor, a really beautiful song. And this bird has replaced in popularity the large-billed seed finch, and that bird replaced the great-billed seed finch, which we believe is now endangered due to trade. So it has the classic signature of trade driving declines in species, which has caused other substitute species to be brought into the trade. So lots of really sweet species here. As you can see, most of them are pretty drab colored, which has probably been the reason that they haven't received a lot of attention. So we're excited to support these beautiful brown birds. So the legality of this is complicated. And so I just wanted to show briefly what the trade chain looks like, where it's legal, where it's illegal, in just say from Guyana to the US. But again, that's just one of these country pairings. There's many different movements through different countries. So it's actually legal in Guyana to harvest these birds during the open season, but it's illegal to harvest during the closed season. It is legal to keep these birds and train them in Guyana. And once they start to move out of the country, it is legal to bring them to the US if you declare them as a wildlife shipment and you go through all the documentation, which involves health certificates from Guyana and quarantine in the US, as well as permitting. And if they comply with the Lacey Act, then they're also legal. So the Lacey Act is a really big law that basically says if you have a lie and a border, it's illegal. So meaning if the Lacey Act basically acknowledges that there are certain species that can't be transported across states or nations. And in the US, if that species is protected in Guyana, then it's also protected here. So it's kind of applies the law back home into this new place where the import is happening. And it's illegal if you don't do any of that stuff. Like if you conceal, like a body carry, and you don't declare, then it's illegal. Once it's in the US, it is actually legal to keep and train the birds, meaning that there's no law that says it's illegal. But it is illegal if you're selling and transporting in a way that breaks the Lacey Act that I just talked about. And then, of course, the singing competitions are also legal because we don't have a law in the US that says you can't compete birds like that. So as you can see, it's complicated and there are loopholes, meaning that there aren't laws that apply to everything. So it's possible to go through an illegal behavior and then it's legal later on. And that makes it quite hard for our law enforcement to keep accountable some of these things. But it's also legal in many ways. And there's a process for going through the system legally. And so our goal is actually not to stop this trade chain. Our goal is to facilitate and enable better legal and sustainable trade of these birds. I also want to point out that it's complicated because there are different power dynamics at play in the people involved in these systems. So there's potential marginalization of non-dominant subgroups. Let's just look at the suppliers, for example. These are rural indigenous trappers. You can imagine the kind of persecution they've faced, the kind of marginalization they might face, and the power dynamics at play if a law enforcement officer comes from the city and starts asking questions or tries to look at their activities. there's not trust, perhaps. There's a lot of, just you can imagine the issues. Same in the US. The consumers here are diaspora from Guyana in this case. And so a lot of them have immigrated or their families are going through immigration. You can imagine the kinds of challenges that those groups may face when rubbing up against authorities. And so we want to be very sensitive in how we tell these stories and how we involve partnerships. And so we are going slowly and carefully to make sure we bring on the right kind of partners and try to acknowledge that this is a hobby that is legal in some ways, can be done legally, and support the people that really just want to connect to what they've been doing back home. So I think that's an important thing to acknowledge. So I know I'm starting to run out of time, and so we'll see where I might flip through some of these next slides. But in short, the goal of our Species Conservation Catalyst Fund on Songbirds is to use $5 million of financial assistance that in 10 years reduces the illegal unsustainable trade and facilitates the legal sustainable trade if that's appropriate and can be done well, and catalyzes future conservation momentum on these species. So let me see if, I'm not going to walk you through this, but if anyone's curious about our situation analysis or results chains, happy to talk about it later. But in short, we came up with these various approaches that we think are the major needs. And we wove these into our notice of funding opportunity and asked the applicants to consider how they might address these issues. So let's see, when did we launch it? Late summer of last year, was due in December of last year. We posted our first funding opportunity. And we just finished our merit review panel where we bring together anywhere between 3 and 5 reviewers, look at all the applicants, make decisions, and make funding recommendations, which our financial team then looks at and decides if those awards do meet our federal requirements and we can issue them. I can definitely talk more about what that process looks like if you have questions. And we will be awarding 7 awards for about $3.5 million. Now, I told you, if you remember, that we have $1.5 million available each year in appropriations from Congress. And so that means that we'll be paying that out over time through the life of the project. So the project will probably receive 1 year at a time in support. And each award will be about $150,000 to $700,000. So these are grants and cooperative agreements. We have a few very close partnerships across the world with 3 different projects, if I remember right. And we're really excited to see these go soon. So we're just issuing the awards now. Skip through that too. So these are our successes to date. We've committed across cheetah, saiga, and songbird $8.2 million. And we intend to invest the $15 million that I mentioned, $5 million per species. And we are considering already our 4th taxa candidate, which, like I mentioned, we're thinking about plants, aquatic species, and invertebrates. We've received a lot of positive feedback from partners that are excited about the collaborative nature of what we're trying to create and the capacity building focus. For example, we invite applicants to propose some professional development activities as part of their awards. And of course, many of these species they've been wanting to work on, like the songbirds, they just haven't been able to find any funding that would be the right fit. So they're really excited to see some of these species receive support for the trafficking side of it. I mentioned the coordination, and yeah, we have seen our projects that have been proposed are really going to fill these critical gaps in knowledge and data. And that takes us back to, remember, the beginning of our talk where we talked about the lack of data and how challenging it is to track these illicit activities. So we're, through these projects, very hopeful that we'll start to fill in some information, like understanding which populations are in decline, how the trade rates are happening, and try to fill in all those unanswered questions about the trade chain in general. So this is my information, and I'm happy to take any questions. Yeah.
Can you give some examples of organizations that have been awarded and what projects they have been working on?
I wish I could, but the notice of funding hasn't been awarded yet. So they haven't received their official letters. And so just in case there's any final hangup, it's the federal government, you know. What I can say about songbirds is that the whole geography is represented. So we're going to have projects in Suriname, Guyana, Brazil, and Trinidad, as well as the US, Canada, and the Netherlands. So we're excited that we have both the source countries and the demand countries at play. And they, as a whole, have really gotten into some of these those results chains that I showed you. And so they're going to be doing a lot of social science research to understand what's motivating and what are the barriers that people are experiencing in terms of their behavior. So why do they want to do this trade? What's hard about it? What's good about it now? What needs to be changed? They're going to be doing legal reviews to understand based on the existing frameworks at play, where are the gaps, where are the loopholes, what's working, what's not working, thinking about things like CITES, that international treaty mechanism. Is that appropriate? Because none of those species, except for the siskin and the Cuban bullfinch, are listed under CITES at the moment. So international trade isn't regulated, even though it's obviously causing declines. So CITES could be one mechanism. So, but there's also could be negative repercussions of that. So yeah, those are some of the things. And actually saiga and cheetah have many parallels, except that both those species are so challenging to regulate. And cheetah is one of those species that the declines are just too large with trade. We can't really envision how sustainable trade would be possible for those species. So they're trying to stop the trade. A little bit of a different approach. Yeah.
Comes on. Hello, can everybody hear me on the other end? I'm changing microphones. Maybe. I'm just trying to make it where the people on the other end of Zoom can actually hear you asking the questions. I'm gonna hope this is working.
Thank you. That was a great talk, and I'm very impressed with all the planning that went into it. Can you tell us a little bit about how your branch thought about interactions with the Endangered Species Act side, either wanting to avoid regulated species or potentially thinking about species that aren't yet regulated but that are highly impacted by US trade and maybe wanting to get someone to petition?
Okay, so your question was about the Endangered Species Act, and did that inform our work?
Are you trying to avoid species that were regulated, trying to get people to petition ones that are highly impacted by US trade but not currently?
That's a good question, and asked by a former ES foreign listing perspective too. We actually didn't think too much about the Endangered Species Act when prioritizing our species. I'm trying to think about what insight. Yeah. So the ESA doesn't have the same teeth for foreign species as it does for domestic species. And so it's not actually a tool that we talk about or see at play in the species that we're working on, really. So that is an interesting question. I'm going to think more about it, and maybe we can talk about it more. I'd love to pick your brain a little bit more about that. Yeah. So the ESA, I will say, is the law that that enables our financial assistance to be kind of doled out. But besides that, in terms of the prioritization process, we didn't look at that. Yeah. I will mention that none of these songbird species are listed under the Migratory Birds Act or any other US law except the Lacey Act. So they're not migratory species except for the painted bunting and the grosbeak. So those are the only two that would apply under the Migratory Bird Act. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a really interesting talk. I was kind of curious about the projects that what Viv was asking about, and understanding that you probably won't be able to answer it fully. So you mentioned that a lot of NGOs are recipients. I was curious also, are the governments also receiving money? Because I would think that would be key to enforcement of laws, which I would think would be part of this.
Absolutely. Yeah, governments are able to apply. They're eligible. We didn't actually receive any applications from governments directly, but the one government that is directly involved in a project is in Guyana. So there's a Guyanese agency that's involved there. They are the Wildlife Authority, and so they were eager to build up their capacity and also lean into this project. And that's going to be a cool collaboration because there'll be an NGOs with that agency. So we're eager to see what happens there. Yeah, but we could potentially give money to other agencies, and we were hoping more would apply, but they haven't yet. So more to be done. I will also say that the applications are required to have an endorsement letter with them from a government agency. And so that already starts the partnerships between, or at least awareness building of the activities that will be done and the local government. Whoever
drives this having songbird in Guyana? Demographically rated like men over 50 or what keeps it going?
Yeah, great question. So you're asking what's the demographic in Guyana that engages in the songbird competitions. And so a lot of the social science research that's going to be done is going to fully flesh that out for us. So there are so many answers, so many questions like what you're asking that haven't yet been studied formally. And we have anecdotes right now. We have the things that we've seen. I went down to Guyana last year. In general, what we observe and have heard about from partners is that the people who are mostly doing these races are somewhere probably between like 30 and say 60. They're not recruiting as many youth as they have been in previous generations as they want to, but most guys do learn about the races from, say, a father or from an uncle. So it is actually a really kind of sweet tradition that can pass through family or the larger community of family. It plays a really important social role too, where the races bring together people from different racial backgrounds, ethnicity, political perspectives, social classes. And truly, I saw that when I was there, and they talked about the role that these races play in serving the community, because the membership dues of the association that I visited gives back to the community through charitable work. They also consider themselves bird stewards in many ways, although they may not work in the environmental sector, but they do care a lot about the birds that they have as family members. They really do. They spend so much time training these birds that they get very attached, and these birds truly are like their children, they say. So yeah, it's a cool hobby. It definitely is. It made me want to start thinking about a bird of my own. Third pet. Sorry, I'm gonna go in the front, but then can we pass the mic in the back? Yeah.
You kind of touched on it, but I was just curious as to and if you aren't able to talk about these necessarily, but perhaps some of the other ones from the other species. First of all, thank you for this presentation. It's so cool to learn about, and I'll definitely check out a lot of these other sites that you shared. But to what extent do you guys focus the awards on enforcement or on perhaps awareness or understanding the cultural context? Because understandably, values of conservation and cultural considerations of species and of the environment can be drastically different to how we see it here in the United States and for the United States government. So I guess just to what extent is the funds that you guys are trying to award dedicated towards programs of enforcement versus maybe awareness or cultural kind of awareness and education kind of programs, if that makes sense.
Thanks for that question. It sounds like you should join our team because these are the kinds of things that we think about a lot. We do need to take a holistic perspective, meaning that law enforcement, building up judiciary systems is important, understanding the motivations and behaviors, as well as thinking about how do we adapt or support positive, constructive behaviors that are sustainable and legal. All of those things are approaches that we think about. Education can be a part of that. But because law enforcement tends to be kind of a more traditional approach where we feel like, yeah, we know that there's capacity gaps and barriers around law enforcement, and we feel that other agencies could perhaps support and fund that kind of work, we're really leaning into the social science side of it and the human dimensions to begin with, especially. So these are all 3 species so far that haven't had a lot of support funding work before. And so they haven't had a lot of activities focused on the trafficking side of these species. And so it's important to start with why are people doing what they're doing and where are those gaps? Yeah. So we're starting with that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sure. There's a question online. So first is from Fitz. He says, super interesting talk, Jen. I'm wondering if you know much about the cultural variability in these singing contests across South America. For example, chestnut-bellied seed finch is a very common and widespread bird across lowland South America. Is it under the same pressure elsewhere as it is in Guyana, or is the cultural norm in Guyana an extreme example?
Yeah, that is such an interesting thing to think about. And I've been surprised to hear that singing competitions are not as popular elsewhere in South America as they are in the Guyana Shield. So the countries I've mentioned so far, Guyana, Suriname, Brazil, Trinidad, Venezuela is an interesting country. It's tough for us to do work there right now because of the sanctions. And so we actually can't support work that's being done in a certain way there. Yeah, so cultural variations are major across South America. And so the singing competitions really are popular in the Guyana Shield, also in Cuba. There are cultural differences within countries or even possibly within, I don't know, maybe even associations, bird associations. So when I went to Guyana, they have a structure for the races that day that were who can sing, which bird can sing the most of this certain sequence of notes in 5 minutes. And whoever sang the most would win the trophy. But in Trinidad, they had, I think it was a 2-minute race where they could, or whoever could sing 50 of the calls within a certain amount of time or something. So they have slightly different structures to the races themselves, which are interesting. Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that question.
Hi, I was wondering if with your organization, if it's in your scope to do anything to sort of allow the indigenous trappers to get more benefit from the process. And I have another question after this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You've been waiting so long, so you can ask too. Yes, absolutely. So we went down there and we started talking with the trappers to see how much they knew about this trade chain. It was interesting to see that they didn't have much visibility of where these birds were going. They knew maybe they're going to Georgetown because everything tends to go that direction, but they didn't even know that they were being used for singing competitions, meaning that they didn't know the end product and they didn't know the exploitation that they were facing themselves. So $10 for a bird when they're getting 10,000 later on is a big disadvantage. And so they started thinking, wow, maybe we could join up as a group and standardize our rates so that, you know, this person over here isn't selling for $2, which then screws over everybody else in the community. And so we are interested in supporting like work that is co-designed with those communities where they're not just a beneficiary of the project, but they're actually a stakeholder, they're a relevant party deciding those activities from the beginning. So I think all of the projects that we've supported have either involved participatory work where they're doing interviews and they're incorporating the ideas and they're really locally driven solutions, or they're actually partnering with those communities as an equal decision maker in that process. So we've all learned like that's how you do conservation these days to really succeed, thankfully. So yeah, that's the direction we're heading.
And another thing, so in the context of making the regulations or like the trade safer for the birds, you're worried about like a hypothetical where then like because all the birds survive, like when they get to wherever they get, is there a worry that they might become invasive and that might cause another issue, or is that very unlikely?
You should also join our team because we're definitely thinking about that. Yes, so as an example of that, we've heard stories that songbird keepers, this was a story in Trinidad, they shared with us that the songbird keepers don't work, so it's complicated, but because their birds are illegal, meaning that there's a regulation in place where all the birds coming into Trinidad, because they've trapped out their local species, there's pretty much no birds to be caught wild in Trinidad. So they bring everything in from Venezuela or Guyana or Suriname. And so all the birds are coming in, they're required to have a permit, they're required to go through quarantine. But the way the permit was set up, that process was set up pretty much overnight in a way that was really cumbersome for people to comply. So there's a 99% non-compliance rate. Wow. So every bird coming into the country is illegal, but the system that they had put in place, that the government put in place, these are stories. So the work will be done to determine how there's always two sides to a story, but that it's almost impossible to actually get a permit. And so here's an interesting question. We were talking about the trade chain and who is truly a trafficker. Can you argue that those people are traffickers if they can't even navigate their own legal system, right? We could argue that from some of our, perhaps our US laws too. And so my point is that they're shying away from authorities. They don't work very closely with vets when their birds get sick. And so if their bird looks like it's going to pass away, they want it to have a dignified death and they will release it into their neighborhood. So that, whether that's an invasive species is actually, you can debate that because they used to be there, they're not anymore. Some of those species they're bringing in are not native to Trinidad or don't have a history of being known in that island. And so, yes, there's the potential of them becoming invasive species. But so far, we haven't seen any populations really take off. I don't know if that's because if they did, they'd be trapped again. There's so many dynamics here. It's a really interesting system, but certainly anytime you have an animal in trade, I know maybe you're thinking about that because we're in Florida and we have all these invasive species that have come through here because of trade, but it can certainly become a problem. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I'll be around.
Well, and since you asked, now on the map, there's some other countries that have question marks on them. What are those countries represented? Like Jamaica, for example.
Right, so we've heard that is possibly a transit country, meaning that the birds are taken through there to then get to a final destination, or that there might be some kind of trade, but very anecdotal. We don't have a lot of evidence yet. So we put a question mark to follow up on it and see what we hear. So if you have any additional information, we would love to hear about it. Yeah. It's interesting because we have many different parties involved. We each have a small piece of this very complex puzzle. And until we all get together and start telling these stories about what we're observing, it's hard to piece together this whole trade chain. So that's what we've been doing over the last 2 years, but we clearly have, many more years to go.
Right. Amartya has a question. Miami has a large Caribbean community where what happens back at home happens here too. Does your effort pay NGOs to try to decrease import of songbirds into the US, or is it more focused on making Guyanese aware of the dangers of declining numbers in their birds?
Great questions. Probably I can answer your question in a couple of years once we start to better have the social science in place and the interviews are exposing sort of what are the barriers, what's working, what's not working. But I can say that, yeah, Miami is a really tricky place probably for our teams to do their work because there have been some operations, a number of different law enforcement operations from the Fish and Wildlife Service. And so people are naturally more skittish. The bird races there are much more underground than they are, say, in New York, where you can see them out in the open. And so it'll be a different approach needed to do the work in Miami than in New York. So, and of course, in Miami, you have this mixing of a lot of different communities, including the Cuban community. So that adds another dimension too. So thanks for that question.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Jen, for coming.